Sophia, welcome. I'm really excited to have you and excited to chat about product experimentation and best practices associated with it. I will just dive right in. And you basically did a lot of experiments as a PLG product-led growth lead at HubSpot, which was B2B software. Now you're at Redfin doing product-led in some ways. I'd love to hear what are some of your learnings like in these experiments that you did at HubSpot and maybe at Redfin.
Yeah, I think one of my favorite learnings overall is sometimes the smallest changes can have the biggest impact, as basic as it sounds. One of my favorite insights is that FOMO is real. People are often more motivated by what they're going to miss out on than by what they are going to get, which particularly in a B2B SaaS context, I think is maybe sounds intuitive, but can be somewhat surprising because you're often focused on what you're providing to customers, right? So one of the most impactful experiments we ever did with trials was we introduced a modal that emphasized what you were going to lose out on at the end of the trial. It like really leaned into the idea of FOMO, like you're going to lose these things. And we had a double-digit impact on monetization and it increased touchless purchases. And it was such a small change, but it was one of the most impactful experiments. And I've just seen that insight to be true and play out time and time again.
That's amazing. And like you said, it seems obvious, but I think sometimes the obvious psychological things that we know, translating that into what to do in a product is not trivial. So I think it is insightful to say, hey, run that loss aversion campaign. And I've seen it firsthand. I think canceling Canva and others that tell you the specific feature you've used
Yeah.
that you will lose out on. And it does make you double think. And I don't know if it's a dark pattern or maybe it's not, but it goes along the idea of the reverse trial, which is give people access, let them fall in love with the product, let them see the value in the product, and then have them make a decision rather than making a decision on something without ever having experienced it or knowing it, etc.
Yeah, 100%. Or like Amazon, if you go to cancel Amazon Prime, they tell you how much savings you're going to lose. I've seen it in all those content,
Mm,
B2C and B2B.
mm,
It's really powerful.
And I think one of the things I'm taking away is not just at the end, not just in the cancellation flow, but do it in the trial flow,
Yes.
which is really cool. So that's what. Let's talk about like experiments generally. Should all PMs be experimenting? Obviously, everyone thinks of, oh, that's the right way to do it. It's to be experimenting, to be data driven. Should everyone always be experimenting? Like, how do you decide? What?
Yeah. I think the answer is no. From my perspective, I do think it's a very important tool. And I do think there are some PMs that could leverage it more, particularly like core PMs and B2B SaaS sometimes don't really lean on it enough. That being said, I think often there are PMs that lean too much in experimentation and it becomes defining factor of what they do. Like oftentimes you might ask the growth PM and they might be like, I do experiments, right? Experimentation should never be how you describe your role or what you're doing 100% of the time. It's a tool in your tool belt. And so I think a really key question that you should ask yourself every time you go to run an experiment is this high risk? Do I need precise measurement of the impact? That's a really important one. And the last is, will the results of this experiment materially change what I would do next? And the last two ones are where I see a lot of PMs fall into a trap of wanting to know what happens, but sometimes you don't need precise. I think precise measurement is really important. Sometimes just you can get directional without running an experiment by doing phased rollout or pre-post. There's also a lot of changes that are relatively low risk or might be really a big strategic change that you need to make that you're likely to do regardless. And it's important to remember that there's a cost to experimentation, setting up an experiment, doing the analysis, making a decision. And so you want to make sure that cost is really worth it.
Yeah, great points. And it reminds me of a few things. One is like the fact that people, when they think about experimentation, really neglect qualitative learning. And if you do 5 user interviews, you might learn as much as you would in an experiment that gives you data, and then you're still trying to figure out like what happened or why it didn't lead to an outcome. Bringing in qual into your thinking about experimentation. So that's one thing. I think the second thing is this rebalancing away from just like being super always experiment on, always data driven on with the likes of linear being a standout as someone who's like put a stake in the ground. Hey, we're
Yeah.
not doing experiments. We
Yeah.
any type of thing. We're not going to
Yes.
use analytics in a way. We're going to just listen to customers. We're going to do craft. We're going to rely on our understanding, intuition, design sense, and yet they still succeed. So I think it's nice to have a counter example to all of the companies that are super data oriented.
It's a great example. And yeah, I think those are really great points. At the end of the day, experiments tell you what happens, but it doesn't tell you the why behind it. And so that's why that question of do you need precise measurement is just so important.
And so it sounds like those are started to talk about some good practices or best practices for experimenting. You said, consider, is this thing that I'm experimenting high risk or not? Is this something where I need precise measurement? And is it going to make a material impact in my decision? And sometimes people collect data for the sake of data. And I'm always like, wait,
Mhm.
are you going to do anything with this data? Like what? Don't ask people questions in the onboarding flow if you're not going to use the answers
Yeah.
like subsequently. But anyway, those are three practices it sounds like you referenced. Are there any other good practices or potentially pitfalls to
Yeah.
experimenting?
I think a really important one on the note of just relying too much on data sometimes is I think a really important thing is having a clear primary metric to make a decision. Ideally, it should be one. That doesn't mean that's the only metric that you look at when you're making a decision, but it's the primary one that you're going to make a decision on. What that means is that there might be secondary metrics that you look at to understand a little bit more of the behavior behind of what's driving that primary metric. You might also have guardrail metrics that you want to put in place so that you make sure that you're not cannibalizing something else or hurting something else further down the funnel. But I've seen a big pitfall is I've seen a lot of PMs sometimes list out like all these metrics they're going to look at in an experiment, but
Mm,
then it's not really clear the prioritization or what is actually really important. And you can get trapped in analysis paralysis, and it can be really hard to then make decisions. So I'm a huge advocate of just having a clear primary metric. And sometimes it can't be one, but should not be that many. And really setting those out from the outset, I think is really important. Another thing too is I think having a clear hypothesis that focuses both on a business opportunity and on customer impact. I've worked in a bunch of different contexts and I've seen, I think, especially like in the B2C context, oftentimes PMs can bias more to business opportunity and not bring in enough of the customer insight, and vice versa can often happen in B2B SaaS. I think the best experiments are those that really are a combination of both.
both business opportunity and customer impact or perspective.
Yes, and I know that seems obvious, but you'd be surprised how much I've seen experiments bias towards one of those so
Mm,
much that you're like, I see how this is a big business opportunity, but what problem are we actually solving
mm.
for customers? Yeah.
And how do you measure the customer impact? Because the business opportunity is a little bit easier where you've got like numbers or revenue. Do you measure customer impact also in terms of product usage and adoption, or is it like sentiment or NPS, or is it just like qualitative? How do you think about that?
I think it depends. I think NPS can be great. I think oftentimes looking at qual is also really important. I mean, I've run a lot of experiments where we look at the data, but we also talk to customers about the experience as well. I mean, you can also look at other measures of usability, again, depending on the product that you have, like time to task, time spent on a specific page, right?
Mm,
Click paths. Those are other things that you can look at. Again, I know those are more data, but they can tell you a little bit more on like how easy something is to use
mm.
too, right? And satisfaction.
Yeah, I love that. Just like really, again, almost like back to the linear thing, like focusing on the customer experience in a way and making sure that's moving forward. It sometimes reminds me in the marketing parallel where, folks are churning out these SEO oriented articles and you're like, oh, yeah, they're ranking well, but you read them, you're like, this doesn't tell me anything.
Right.
It's more, what's the user experience here? So I think you need
Yeah.
to think about it. It needs to be good in ranking, but it needs to be, I think, interesting as well.
Right.
Uh, but I mean, you're doing a lot of experiments. Doesn't always work, and most cases that probably won't work or won't meet the alternative hypothesis. And so, how do you continue to retain momentum, motivation to keep trying? Do you
Yeah.
see that dip and you move to a different area? How do you like get to the end of the experimentation cycle?
Yeah. I think the most important thing in keeping momentum high is really orienting your perspective on experimentation around learning. As long as you're focused on learning, when things don't work out, it's shouldn't be seen as a failure
Yeah.
because instead you're saying, hey, we learned something and we have a good idea on what to do next. I actually think sometimes the worst experiments are the ones where nothing happens in either direction, like you don't get anything from it. I think as long as you, yeah, again, are focused on learning, I think as a leader, actually sometimes broadcasting failures. So a lot of times PMs are encouraged to only broadcast their wins.
Mm,
That's what gets them promotions or celebratory moments from leadership
mm,
or whatever. But I think failures can be so insightful and can really help drive a complete sort of pivot in strategy. I also think keeping momentum, another thing that can really help keep momentum high is, I think you alluded to this a little bit, is also knowing when to cut your losses when you're like, we've squeezed all of the juice out of this particular part of the funnel or page or whatever it is. And I think sometimes people can fall in the trap of like rotating. And usually a sign of that is you're just doing a ton of experiments and nothing's happening in either
mm,
direction.
mm.
Doing that for a while and you're just not seeing that. That means you got to change tack.
Yeah, and maybe like absence of learning. But yeah, love that. Matt Bellotti, we were talking, we did an AMA with, he had something similar, he said something similar about like just focusing on learning. So that's a really good reminder. We're almost at time, so let's do a couple of quick fire things. What are your go-to resources for learning new things?
Yeah. I'll be I think everybody points out specific newsletters like Lemmy's but honestly lately the place I found most insightful is actually learning from peers. I'm part of a product leadership group from folks from other companies and I've learned a lot from other people. I think particularly as you advance in your career, this is like one of the most helpful things. They often will share resources, but you also just get insight into how they might work through similar challenges in other contexts. And I think at a certain point, you tap out of all the sort of the frameworks and there's only so much of that you can absorb and try. But I think that's where learning through others and talking with others can be really helpful.
Yep. It's a frequent theme I think I've heard is the importance of peers and learning from them. All right. Last question. What's a product you use regularly and or love and why?
Yeah. So I'm expecting my first baby in a few weeks in summer,
Right.
my biggest project yet. And I've been really loving baby lists for my registry and also even keeping track of things that I need to buy, like that even things that we're not going to look to be gifted. It's made it really easy for me to understand, especially as a first time period, like all the key categories of items that I need to buy, and I can organize them by category and even create a private list of things that we're going to buy. I also really appreciate the way that they have curated lists of the top things you need in the first few weeks for newborns. I think so much of being a first time parent, there's so much of stress around all the things that you need. And so that's made it really easy. They make it easy to keep track of purchases, get lists to send thank you notes, like really they've really thought through the full end to end experience. Yeah, I've just found it a joy to use.
Amazing. We use baby lists as well. So I hear that, but that's awesome. Okay. Thank you so much for joining
Yeah.
us. We hope we talk again soon and appreciate all the insights that you shared around experimentation.
Thanks so much. This was great.